Yes, sir. Oh, look at my face. It's so big on the screen. Hello, is it time already? Yes, right on time. Hi, everyone. I'm João Florêncio. I'm a senior lecturer in art history at the University of Exeter, and I'm on the steering group of the Mascnet network, and I'm chairing the session today, which is entitled, if I recall, Diverse Objects, Diverse Methods. We'll have 3 speakers, and I'll introduce them one by one as they, before they speak. So we will start with Spyros Boviatsis. Okay. And I highlighted your wrong thing. 1 second, I will find this.
Right.
There, Spyros is a social scientist whose areas of interest include gender and sexuality, childhood, education, and refugees. He holds a BA in political science and public administration and an MA in education and human rights. Currently, he's working in 3 European programs, 2 regarding LGBTQI plus rights, and 1 on refugee support. And he lives in Piraeus in Greece. I am really sorry. And Spyros' talk this afternoon or this morning, depending where you are, is entitled Lost in Time When Queer Boys Unbecome Men. And I hand over to you, Spyros.
Thank you so much. You said correctly every single name, so bravo. This is a new one for me. I'm really happy to be here. So today I'm going to talk about queer and kid identities. This paper is based on my master's thesis, in which I examine the experiences of queer boys in Greek schools. However, during the research and the writing of my thesis, it became clear that it is almost impossible to talk about school experience and queer identities without also examining the role of the family, sometimes even at the same time. So we will mainly focus on the early education years with a hint of high school, and we will see how family and school affect the formation of queer kid identities. But first, how is the child connected with sexuality and even queer identities? Looking at some crucial texts, we see that today's idea of children emerged and thrived in the 17th century, while they gradually were being associated with nature, innocence, and divinity. Up until then, children were distinguished from adults with economic criteria, which they met through labor. Meanwhile, around that time, children lost any element of sexual expression, as sexuality was transferred to the family and sex was linked exclusively to reproduction. So now sexuality has transformed into the main distinguished characteristic between children and adults, and children are characterized by negative inversions, such as innocence, purity, and emptiness. So it is apparent that children's relationship with sexuality is a complicated one, and it gets even more complicated when we bring homosexuality to the table. A fascinating take on the connection between children and queerness is Endelman's book No Future, which basically presents the child, singular and with a capital C, as a symbol for the heteronormative future, which is completely anti-queer. According to Edelman, the child is the imaginary beneficiary of every policy and an ideal citizen who claims their full rights against the rights of others, for example, queer people. That's why Edelman disavows the child and the future it represents and suggests the embrace of queer negativity and death drive. However, years before that book, Sedgwick had shown that this connection between children and homosexuality was actively attempted by psychoanalysts who pathologized the effeminacy of boys, cut ties between gay boys and homosexual adults, and encouraged parents to raise their kids straight. Finally, Stockton talked about the queer child and its 4 forms, which all deviate from the expected sexuality of children. The gay ghost child, which was the gay child who couldn't experience its gay identity until later in life and can be tracked only by looking back in a process called backward birthing. The grown homosexual, who is characterized by sexual immaturity due to his inability to have children. The child queer by Freud, which is based on Freud's interpretation of children's sexuality. And finally, the child queer by innocence, which is characterized by the upcoming loss of its innocence and its substitution by adulthood. That was a really succinct presentation of the basic theoretical framework. Here you also see a simplified version of the Greek school system. There are 3 school levels. Mandatory education is up until the 11th class, which is the 3rd year of gymnasium, where kids are around 14 years old. Today's paper covers mainly primary school and gymnasium. Regarding the research, 8 semi-structured interviews were conducted, 2 of them in person and 6 of them online due to the pandemic. And the participants had to be between the age of 18 and 25. They had to be men who have sex with men, and finally to have some sort of realization of their sexual identity during school. So let's start with the families. Through the interviews, family is treated as a group that is being represented socially by the family members. Kids participate in this social representation with their behavior, grades, and meet of social standards. If they fail, they put the family social representation at risk. That's why queer identities emerge as opposition to societal and consequently to family values. In general, a queer identity is capable of bringing disgrace to the family in the mind of most parents, which suddenly faces the danger of losing its normality. Here, Harry mentions that when his father learned about his homosexual identity, he disowned him, he threw him out of the house at the age of 16, and he ordered him to change his last name. In this case, the disgrace was so impactful for the father that it severed any bond with his son, who now was replaced by the faggot. In a similar note, Vangelis mentioned his uncle's threat of disowning him in case his nephew hangs out with them, meaning the homosexuals, while Nectarios recalled his mother, implying she preferred her sons dead rather than gay. Spoiler alert, one is gay and the other one is pansexual. However, families do not just let any hint of queerness slide off. They actually use some methods to regulate the situation. One of them is a non-recognition of the identity. According to Honest, recognition plays a crucial role in self-realization, which is linked with love in a personal level, rights in an institutional level, and solidarity in a social level. 7 out of 8 narrators described instances in which their parents, with emphasis on their mothers, refused to recognize their homoerotic identities, even though the narrators had either hinted at it or had come out. In 4 out of 8 occasions where the children had come out, parents did not recognize / validate their identities, and even attempting to silence them in hopes of not presenting their children with a viable option of experiencing their identity. Yannis, for example, believes that his mother refuses to accept his identity because that would mean she greenlights the realization and the experience of the identity. In the same note, Vangelis mentions that when he was announcing to his mother that he was going out with a man, his mother was just calling him names. At this point, when I was analyzing the data, I came across a very interesting speculation. With the exception of Harry, who at the end was called the faggot and was thrown out of the house, none of the narrators faced homophobic insults from the family, despite their parents being homophobic. And that may be a result of the non-recognition of their queer identity and their parents' desire not to validate them, because if they had called them a faggot, they would consolidate their kids' queerness as an actual identity. In this context, individuals describe their families' further attempts to regulate their queer identity. The critical foundation of these attempts is doubting their children's identities and treating their children as unreliable narrators of their own feelings and experience. The kid identity of the narrators was weaponized as to destabilize their embracing of their queer identity. On one hand, Manos remembers his parents telling him that he is a child and unable to know for sure. Also, he later adds that his father prompts him to experience his bisexuality in a heteronormative way by forgetting about men. On the other hand, Yannis talks about his mother's response to the possibility of him adopting as a gay man, where she implied that he is not mature enough to discuss these things. As Plummer says, stories also provide guidelines and memories, maps and scripts for locating our human actions in past, present, and future. It is through stories that people can generate a sense of how they are situated in the wider world. So families' intervention to the children's stories is not coincidental. It aims at the shift of perception and the reinterpretation of their experience. So now parents are no longer passive receivers of the news, but active co-managers of the identity. Moving on to school, we see that what happens in and out of the classrooms with fellow students and teachers is fundamental to children's construction of identity. During school years, the most basic element of male homosexuality was football, and the failure to participate in it was equal to exclusion and stigma. The narrators were forced to form friendships with other excluded kids, and finally, the kid's supposed innocence becomes the main opponent to homosexual identities. So let's take a closer look. According to Giannakopoulos, male homosexuality is the prime locus of reproduction and production of gender power relations, male dominance, and female subordination. In school, football is at the core of male homosexuality. Sports in general represent a form of legitimized, ritualized, and socially acceptable violence which aims at teaching boys of being masculine and at the cultivation of male attributes which distinguish boys from girls. According to Epstein et al., football and fighting become a measure of success as boys/men and a more important achievement than academic success, which relative failure or lack of interest in them becomes a marker of stigmatized effeminacy or homosexuality. Furthermore, it sets a hierarchy for masculinity depending on the role each person has on the team. For example, none of the narrators was ever a quarterback. In Christo's case, he felt the pressure to participate in a football team in order to hang out with the boys. However, he failed just like the rest of the narrators, and all of them mentioned negative reactions to their poor football performance by the team members. And this is when we meet the first homophobic remarks. Through the interviews, it became clear that children do not use homophobic slurs to attack one's sexual identity, but to attack his gender expression. The slurs signify that the receiver of the comment is not one of the boys. He's the one who hangs out with the girls in Stavros' case, and it is linked to the awareness of one's the awareness of one's sexuality. At the same time, according to Allen, homophobia is neither expressed necessarily by a specific individual, nor does it target only people with an expressed queer identity, but is actually manifested by a system of heteronormative values. So, in male groups, homophobia is used to enforce normative ideals and to police the gender expression of boys. And just like that, without any reason for personal homophobic attacks, without any specific subject or target, homosexuality and queerness are not the reasons for the attacks, but the general context whose reference aims at the reminding of subordination of stigmatized and hierarchically lower masculinities. Now, we have seen the usage of homophobic slurs by kids who don't know exactly what that word means, let alone what sexuality is. So how does the receiver of the slur identify us? The answer to that word is different. It's a word different. Furthermore, all the narrators, one way or another, mentioned in school they were hanging out with a different kids and almost exclusively with girls. These friendships emerged as a coping mechanism, a response to kids' exclusion and marginalization, and at the same time, a safe space where they could recognize each other's marginalization and express themselves to a certain extent. This description brings to mind male homosexuality. However, these groups are polar opposites. Male homosexualities are based on the recognition of the hegemonic heterosexual masculinity of its members through common practices and gender rituals. Meanwhile, these marginalized friend groups aim at the recognition of each other's subordinated position in the school hierarchy and at the creation of a support network. Hanging out with a different kid doesn't seem that uncommon because, as Epstein and Johnson mentioned, young gay and lesbian students may identify strongly with other subordinated groups. However, it was the subordinated position, not the homosexual identity, that led to befriending different kids. And this subordinated position could be expressed in many forms and ways. For example, for the narrators, it was among others the failure at sports, and for some girls, it was fatness. According to Baker, this deviance is a result of breaking the social rules and does not reflect the quality of specific action. So it became clear that the label of different is a means of negotiation, of subordination, and a way to create livable environments, a way to reject other people's label and to navigate stigma. In this intense environment, there is little to non-support of the marginalized students from teachers, and one of the reasons is the supposed innocence of the children, which was mentioned in every interview. Innocence excuses kids' behavior while it absolves them of any political or social meaning, as we can see in Mano's case. However, innocence is also used as a base for homophobia. Due to their vulnerability, children's innocence need protection because it is constantly threatened. In the case of innocence being spoiled, there is the possibility of innocence also getting lost, and then childhood will be lost as well. This will be a wound to the symbolic system that has been constructed around the idea of the child, because children represent the heteronormative and reproductional future, and in no way can they be combined with queer identities in the public eye. That's why it comes as no surprise that almost none of the narrators had received any homophobic comments because of their sexuality. The comments were usually based on the lack of hegemonic or acceptable masculinity. And even though it is not impossible for a child to be recognized as queer later, it is apparent that at first the identity is covered by what Epstein and Johnson call the heterosexual presumption, which is the notion that people are perceived first and foremost as heterosexual. This heterosexual presumption, combined with non-recognition as well as heteronormativity and homophobia, can lead to the formation of defensive asexual identities, which work complementary to the identity of difference. In this case, children abstain from conversations and practices related to sexuality in general as to not to be discovered. I am afraid that I have run out of time. For the last section, I will just say that homosexuality is perceived as a contagious anomaly from which kids must be protected. This also highlights the fragility of the naturalized heterosexuality, which must be protected as well, and doesn't seem like an undeniable truth anymore. And even though parents in school attempt to ignore queer children's identity and behave like nothing has happened, we can say that queer children get a different treatment and experience. So at the end, we meet the faggot child, which is the gay child that was recognized as danger, but not as a viable option, as his development was denied because that would mean a shameful future and the transcendence of societal values. The faggot child bears two identities, gay and kid, and that are characterized by their distance from the identity of a man. This is the moment that queer temporality takes place, enabling the exploration of unique lived experiences and setting the stage for queer futurity, which reclaims Edelman's disavowed future. So queer kids can create new concepts for the future, which do not set them as plain symbols, but as individuals whose personhood is recognized in every level and identity. And this is the future that every kid deserves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Spyros. That was really interesting, and I may have some questions after, but let's move on to our next speaker. 1 second, as I bring up the bio. Hongwei Bao, who is an associate professor in media studies at the University of Nottingham, where he also directs the Center for Contemporary East Asian Cultural Studies. Hongwei holds a PhD in Gender and Cultural Studies from the University of Sydney in Australia, and his research primarily focuses on queer cultures in contemporary China, including queer media, film, art, and performance. He's the author of Queer Comrades, Gay Identity and Tongzi Activism in Post-Socialist China from National. Okay, and I was trying to read it. NIAS Press 2018, Queer China, Lesbian and Gay Literature and Visual Culture and the Post-Socialism from Routledge 2020. And Queer Media in China, again from Routledge, just out last year. Hongwei's talk this afternoon is entitled, I'm just trying to get everything together, is entitled Performing Transnational Chinese Female Masculinity, Whiskey Chow's Performance Art. Hongwei, over to you.
Thank you for your kind introduction. Can you hear me or can you see this?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, brilliant. So sorry that I revised my title a little bit, but the subject is the same. So as this panel title suggests, we're talking about different subjects and different methods. So it's basically a mishmash of everything. So I am going to talk about the performance art of a Chinese queer diaspora artist currently living in Britain, whose name is Whiskey Chow. And Whiskey was a Chinese feminist activist in China. So she was actively involved in feminist activism. So before she came to the UK, for example, she performed the vagina monologues at Sun Yat-sen University. And then she also had a lot of performance art practices in the country. And then in 2017, a few years ago, she went to the UK and did her MA in contemporary art practice in performance. And ever since then, she has launched her career as a performance artist in Britain. She has curated some queer programs such as Queering Now for Chinese Arts Now, which is an annual Chinese art festival in primarily London. So the outline of my talk is really to look at her artworks and to see how she engages with the notion of masculinity, with this artistic creativity. So I'm looking at her engagement through 4 aspects or 4 modes of engagements. And I'm trying to put forward the argument that her use of the diasporic queer Asian masculinity can be used really as a form of political and cultural critique in contemporary times. Okay, so masculinity is an important theme for Whiskey Chow's works. And she once said in an interview, masculinity is like a keyword in my work. I compare masculinity that I'm talking about with the social temperament of the society. This social temperament is a really nice way to talk about this structure of feeling within the society and how one feels the temperature or the texture of the society. And inevitably, the society that we live in are often categorized by, for example, its masculinism, its patriarchy, its heteronormativity, and so on and so forth. So how would a diasporic Asian queer artist engage with the so-called social temperament of the contemporary society? So a little bit context is important because Asian masculinity in the kind of international order of things is always at the bottom of the hierarchy. So if, for example, other types of masculinity, such as Latino masculinity or Black masculinity or working class masculinity are valorized to be more hegemonic, then Asian masculinities are usually considered to be less valid and less valuable. It's usually equated with things such as femininity, such as asexuality, and so on. So as early as 1991, Richard Feng has an essay called Looking for My Penis, the eroticized Asian in gay video porn, which talks about queer Asian representation in Western media, and in particular in pornography, is feminine and shows a kind of genuine lack of masculinity or lack of penis, so to speak. So in the cultural imaginary of the West. So in such a context, Whiskey Chow is shaping a kind of performance character. So for every performance artist, they try to cultivate a kind of personality. The personality that Whiskey carves out for herself is a drag king personality in Chinese culture. So if you're familiar with Chinese opera, then you might know that on Chinese opera stage, there is this representation of young male and old male masculinities. And in the kind of Western eyes, they actually look pretty feminine, or at least they're not that stereotypical masculine. So Whiskey Chow's approach was really to combine the elements from both the young male and old male characters in Chinese opera and carve out her own personality. At the same time, she's also critiquing the kind of drag king or drag queen performance and performativity in the Western context. For example, in RuPaul's drag show, or in the Western drag king culture, there are particular ways of shaping, there are particular ways of applying cosmetics in that it actually conforms to a kind of Western norm of beauty and masculinity. So Whiskey really combines those elements from both Chinese and Western types of masculinity, make the kind of masculine drag persona in a way really queer, a hybrid creature of all those different elements. And she also uses different means to destroy those cultural symbols. For example, if beard is a stereotypical sense of male masculinity, then the action of destroying the beard in a performance piece is an important gesture for her to deconstruct and to destroy the beard. For example, this is one performance in which she literally put the beer in a blender and try to blend it. Of course, my first thought would be health and safety, but it looks like this was safely executed, and she had all those, if you like, scrums of beard, and then she made a dumpling, or she made really some dumplings out of those beard and meat, etc., and served the audience with the beard. So in a way, actually, the audience are implicated in this scene of gazing and voyeurism and stereotyping masculinities, and with the kind of ambivalent attitudes towards masculinity. So if male masculinity is essentially imagined as this extra meat, i.e. penis, whatever, so in the human anatomy, then in another piece, Whiskey Chow basically presents all those meat in the form of a sausage, really, and destroy them in the process of the performance. And then in another piece, she uses some interesting materials such as balloons and mushrooms, and all those materials are in fact pretty soft. So this in a way responds or corresponds to the academic theory of kind of soft masculinity in East Asia. But at the same time, she applies pressure to these objects, from balloons to mushrooms, etc. And eventually those balloons had to burst in the process, showing that for those kind of middle class, white collar, Asian masculinity, so they have to work hard and achieve success and work out in gyms. Eventually that kind of masculinity actually is kind of unstable, is a very vulnerable form of masculinity, which Whiskey calls wasted masculinity. And she describes intention of her work as, so the work talks about the Western hegemony of masculinity is a pyramid of gender entangled with race and class. Asian masculinity is possibly near the bottom, with a straight white rich male at the top. But meanwhile, this is also a kind of satire of the kind of neoliberal masculinity or neoliberal manhood, in which men actually try to achieve success by incorporating those neoliberal values, eventually actually at the cost of their own physical and mental health. So in some other works, Whiskey actually interrogates a kind of queer Asian masculinity. For example, in a piece from 2 years ago, The Moon is Warmer Than the Sun. So it's more of a memorial piece of the dead or passed away queer icons, including Freddie Mercury, Leslie Chung, and so on. So through this performance, so whiskey actually really, in a way, reconstructs this queer archive for queer Asians, which is not necessarily following the kind of Asian Western identity categories, but meanwhile incorporates or recognizes the transnational nature of queer culture and the diversity of queer masculinities. So, for example, one of the tools she uses is a rabbit, and in Chinese culture, at least, actually, rabbit, the god of rabbit is a god of gay people, queer people. So essentially, she is constructing a kind of queer Asian archive using all those images and imageries. And well, besides, she also interrogates her own identity as a queer diaspora living in the West. For example, in a piece called On Homeliness, she projects all those images of Chinatown. So as you can see, the Chinatown and Soho are probably next to each other geographically. However, as a queer Asian, so they cannot find their home in the Asian culture because of the family-oriented kind of Confucian culture in Asia, nor can they find a home in queer culture because the kind of Western hegemony and Eurocentrism of the queer culture. So it's this sense of unhomeliness that characterizes the queer Asian existence. And another time, she was invited to a Christmas party. So people were expecting her to perform something Asian, and she, well, admittedly, she took something Asian, which is a kind of dancing dragon, in the dragon dance, the head of a dance dragon, and then wearing it and sing Merry Christmas. In a way, actually, defying people's expectation of the cultural authenticity from the perspective of a Chinese native informant. And at the same time, this strange creature becomes a really interesting embodiment of the queer Asian existence in the West, which is probably unfathomable and in a way unimaginable, and is existing outside of the cultural imaginary and representation. And the last piece of work that I'm going to talk about is her latest work, You Must Everywhere Wonder, so created during the pandemic, where she uses all those spices from Asian food or Asian cuisine, and then created this digital performance piece, combining the kind of real performance with the kind of digital art. So this really actually interrogates what is identity and what is, for example, home for Asian queer diasporic people. And for them, actually, it seemed that those spices, those food, were gestures towards a notion of identity that does not have to attach to national identities, that actually is more transformative than identitarian. So, well, I finish my presentation probably with a few pictures of her other works, including her work that satirizes the kind of the rise of China in the Victoria Albert Museum, in which she puts on a banquet showing that kind of Chinese masculinity in the new era. And at the same time, after Brexit, or not after Brexit, actually, in the middle of the Brexit debate, she created this piece called Blue is the Biggest Lie, in which it shows she trying to actually fly, but cannot fly very far, and so on. She used it as a kind of commentary on the Brexit type of nationalist politics. So overall, so I'm using Whiskey Chow's artworks to talk about a mode of queer diasporic Asian engagement with the contemporary discourses of hegemonic masculinity, nationalism, global geopolitics, etc. It does serve in this instance as a particular type of critical intervention into those hegemonic and mainstream discourses. So that's all for my talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Hongwei. We'll move now to our last speaker, Matthew Nielson. And 1 second. Right, okay. So Matthew Nielson is a postdoctoral research fellow funded by the NICHD T32 Postdoctoral Research Fellowship in Developmental Science at the University of Michigan. His research focuses on gender identity development using a bioecological framework. During his master's and PhD program, he focused on socialization of pressure to conform to gender norms, the outcome of acquiescing to or rebelling against this pressure, and how these processes might change over time. In his current work, he's adding to those research aims by including a biological focus, e.g. what role do hormones play in developing gender identity, as well as an intra-individual focus using ecological momentary assessment methods. When not working on school things, he's generally cooking, running, or reading novels, always happy for good book recommendations, maybe. There will be some, feel free to add book recommendations on the chat. So Matthew's talk today is titled Reactions to the Authenticity of Ethnically and Sexually Diverse Men, Marginalized Men. Thank you, Matthew.
Sorry about that introduction. I didn't realize the whole thing would be read out loud, or I would have made it a little shorter. So anyway, now you all know me very well. And can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. This is a pretty neat, like on the outset, these talks seem very disparate, but they're uniting in really solid ways. So I'm excited to present this work, and we can see this picture painted globally of homophobia and the interaction between sexual orientation and ethnic racial background and gender expression. So I will be presenting the work of myself, my colleagues, Brittany Romanello and Hannah Berenson, on the reactions to the gender expressions of ethnically and sexually marginalized men. Okay. So my research is founded on the idea, the theory of intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw, that promotes two main ideas. The first is that everyone has multiple identities, and the second is that these identities have different access to the axes of privilege or oppression. The specific identities that I focused on in this research is sexual orientation and ethnic racial identity, and the intersection between those things. Because these presentations have limited time, I've trimmed it a little bit. So we'll be focusing mainly on the sexual orientation side of things in the discussion, but I'll still talk about some of the ethnic racial identity findings in the results section. In this work, I interviewed 30 young adult men on Arizona State University campus, where I did my PhD. The important thing about this sample is they all identified as at least a little bit gender nonconforming. The reason for this is they came from a larger sample, or they came from a larger research project I was doing on gender norm resistance. And in piloting this work, I found that it was much easier to talk about experiences of masculinity and gender norm socialization among men who already had some experience thinking about and dealing with gender norms, because they felt a little bit outside of the norm. So a limitation of the sample is that it might not generalize to men who feel super gender typical or masculine. So we'll keep that in mind. The men in the sample represented a decent range of ethnic background. The majority was still definitely white, as one would often find in the American Southwest, but there were 5 Latinos and 3 Asian American men in the sample. The majority was heterosexual, but there were 6 men who identified as gay, 3 bisexual, 1 pansexual, and then 2 who actually identified as non-binary. So the results, we'll just dive in. They're oriented around the 2 main research questions: the effect of sexual orientation on their experiences with masculinity, and then the second one is about ethnic racial background. So the first thing I found with sexual orientation is the ubiquity of homophobia. All of the men in the sample, gay, straight, white, men of color, described experiencing homophobia. Exactly how Spyros' work talked about, you know, the homophobic epithets, the rejections, the exclusion, all of those were manifest by the men in my sample as well. The gay men and sexual minority men talked about explicit experiences of homophobia where they were called pejorative names, where they were harassed in the street by strangers. And straight men described that as well, but they also had some pretty interesting other experiences. So one thing that stood out to me is several straight men described the discomfort they felt when they were read as gay. So Felix, who's 18 years old, white and straight, described his college orientation day thus: almost everybody thought I was gay, and that was kind of troubling. Not that it's bad, but I was just thinking, why? And I really liked this because we've got Felix tagging political correctness, right? So it's not cool to not be gay. So it's like, yeah, it's not bad to be gay, but he becomes uncomfortable when he himself is painted with that brush, which to me is a clear indication, despite the verbal performance about political correctness, that he's not comfortable with being read as a sexual minority man. The second main point that we found was this idea we're calling the gay allowance. So it's that men who were openly gay were sometimes excused for their gender non-conforming behavior because they were gay, whereas allegedly straight men who were feminine still experienced harassment. And again, this ties directly into Spyros' findings that men weren't necessarily policed because of their sexual orientation, but because of their gender expression, right? And so men who were openly gay kind of got this pass. It's like, oh, it's okay, he can be feminine because he's gay, and gay men are supposed to be feminine. This was typified by Isaac, who was 21 years old, white and gay. He said, since coming out though, the blessing behind it is no one questions when I do feminine things. I feel like that's always been something that I've had. Again, a luxury of doing is like, I know I can get away with certain things that a lot of guys don't feel like they could get away with. And he attributed that to his gay identity, and expressly to his out gay identity, because he said it changed when he came out of the closet and became more open about his identity. And then the third point that arose with sexual orientation was the idea of gay capital. And this is the idea that gender nonconforming men can receive a claim due to their sexual minority status or their gender nonconforming behavior. So Chase, who's 22 years old, Asian American and straight, talked about experimenting with makeup and other gender nonconforming behaviors and the acceptance that he found in that arena. He said, it also makes me feel different. These guys, referring to gay men, are admirable. I thought, I can be admirable. Not only is it acceptable, resisting gender norms a little bit makes me not only distinguished, but admirable in some circles. I think it's a powerful driver for me. Moving on to the second point, which was, or the second research direction, which was ethnic racial background. The largest point here is that the men in my sample were often navigating masculinity expectations within internalized white masculine norms. We saw this quite a bit in the last presentation, where he talked a lot about the emasculation attributed to Asian men in other cultures. And this was certainly described by the Asian American men in my sample. So often the Latino men and the Asian men in my sample were manifesting this internalization of white masculine norms by describing that they themselves felt othered. So Irvin, who is 28 years old, Latino, straight, said, sometimes here in the US, I feel intimidated a little by these masculinity norms. Sometimes there are groups of, you know what I'm talking about, these kind of dudes with caps and ripped, drinking alcohol. In Mexico, there are no white people. I feel sometimes like, wow, where do they get the money, time, energy to just do that? I have so many things to do. I have to cook, keep up with family, do homework. I have time to relax, but not that much. In this quote, and in many of other of Irvin's quotes, he was describing how he's kind of internalized these white masculine norms, and he's comparing himself to them. And finally, he can't, as an immigrant grad student, like he didn't have the resources or time to perform masculinity in the way that he's seeing his white peers do. And then the Asian American men in my sample described this Asian American emasculation, or I guess Asian emasculation that they were feeling. The first way they described this was feeling physically inadequate. Nathan, who is 23 years old, Korean American background, bisexual, who, important to note here, was several inches higher than the US average height. And so he wasn't a short guy by any means. He said, when I interact around people, I oftentimes feel like I'm a lot shorter in stature, interacting with other guys especially. He went on to say, like, I know that's not true, like I'm not shorter than them, but something about it makes me feel like I'm just shorter and slighter than these guys. And although he wasn't naming it directly, it was easy for me as an outsider to say, you know, maybe it's this, he's dealing with these stereotypes of Asian American men. The second way they described it was the infantilization that they felt when they linked themselves with Asian pop culture in America. So Chase, who is 22 years old, Chinese American and straight, said, if anyone did like me growing up, it was because I was the cute Asian guy and not because I was attractive. That always it didn't bother me, but I tried to distance myself from it, Asian pop culture, because I thought, I'm not cute, I'm a man. And he also had both actually also talked about manga and anime and how they really avoided that as children because they didn't want to be painted with the same brush that they saw there. They were trying to avoid the stereotypical Asian American behavior that their peers knew because they didn't want the connection with that because they felt that it was tied to emasculation, that they were cute rather than manly or masculine. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to talk about the sexual minority findings. So you may have noticed that I described three pretty disparate phenomena. Homophobia, which is the fear or rejection of gender nonconforming, like feminine gender nonconforming behavior. Gay allowance, which is the nominal acceptance of nonconforming behavior. And then gay capital, which is the celebration of gay nonconforming or of nonconforming behavior. I believe in making sense of these patterns. The reason these things could coexist is because it was very contextual. For example, gay capital, I'm going to lose my thing here, was generally limited to progressive enclaves populated by many sexual minorities. This is really consistent with research that I've read coming out of England. Max Morris in 2018 he was the one who coined the term gay capital, and he was finding in urban liberal universities, young gay men were being celebrated for their gender nonconforming behavior. But as it's very clear from Spyros' work and the majority of experiences described in my sample, this isn't the norm, right? It's pretty limited to certain populations. And then the other point that I'd like to raise about how these things all coexist is the idea of gay allowance. Like on the surface, it seems like a pretty progressive, accepting idea. Like, oh, look, like gay men are being accepted for their behavior. But I think in reading a little deeper into it, it's more anytime a gay man's behavior follows a gay stereotype, they're only acting in accordance with what people already expect. So it's almost another manifestation of homophobia. In this way, a gay man's feminine behavior might be excusable, even acceptable, but it's still less desirable than traditionally masculine behavior. It's still others gay men in the sample, and probably in broader circumstances. So I'm excited to keep perusing these ideas. I think that there's a lot here. I posed a question to Spyro that I'm excited to talk about more, whether, the connection between gender expression and homophobia and sexual minority identity. So I'm excited to see where we go with that in the discussion. The limitation, again, there's a lack of generalizability, not only because of the small sample size, but because these men were generally a little bit non-conforming, and it's not longitudinal, so there's no causal connections between identity and the experiences they had. And then in conclusion, I want to share what a neat experience it was conducting these interviews. Afterward, most of the men said what a great time they had talking about masculinity, what a neat space it was to, they often hadn't ever done that with anyone else before, let alone another man. And yeah, it was such a neat experience to be able to engage in this work on masculinity, which felt, even doing this work felt like it was kind of furthering the cause of a general acceptance. Thank you. There's my contact information if you'd like it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you all. I think those three presentations actually worked really well together. There was lots of threads as I was trying to kind of write them down to, pretend to be, smart into the questions for the panel. But I'm not sure if I can, well, I will first do exercise my chair privilege. And I actually, to ask something, but that was really interesting, this narration around kind of, not just in terms of like spatiality, but also temporality that came up with Spyros. So this sense of a temporal or a spatial distance to some kind of idealized form of masculinity, and how that is kind of read, either in terms of sexuality or, well, in terms of sexuality, I guess, and potentially in terms of gender too. But my question, I guess, more directly is for Hongwei. And this is, I know you were talking about diasporic Chinese masculinity, specifically in the context of Whiskey's performance work. But my question is maybe on the other way around, and that has to do, and again, it's just two anecdotes. As a rather hairy Southern European man, once I was on the subway, the tube in Shanghai, and these really funny kind of older kind of granddad, local granddad was sat next to me, and obviously Shanghai was really hot and steamy, and I was sweating all over, so I was just on a t-shirt, and he literally grabs my hairy arms, starts kind of touching them, and really excited about my hair. And the second episode was with regard, I went to a gay bar that had a bear party in Shanghai. And all the iconography, all the posters on the walls were, very much kind of Western, hairy men. And I was actually the only hairy man at the party. Everyone else, kind of local Chinese people were just really buff. I wasn't buff, but I was hairy. So my question is to ask you to speak a bit to maybe what is the relationship between what I perceive in some ways a kind of an idealized form of white Western masculinity in China? How does that feed into kind of Chinese ideals of contemporary Chinese ideas of masculinity? because it's also something that you see a lot in local advertising, which also I found interesting, in that most people advertising kind of high fashion on, banners are Western models, very white. And all of this kind of disturbed me quite a bit. And so I'm kind of wondering, what is this circulation? How do these ideas are currently being kind of doing something in terms of ideas of masculinity in China?
Thank you for your question. So I'll respond briefly, otherwise it would actually become a history of masculinity in China, which would
be great.
important. So I like your two examples. One is at the tube station, and the other with an older man and probably of a working class, and the other one is at a gay bar, which is kind of middle class, transnational, and cosmopolitan consumer space. I think those spatial distinctions are important, and in different spaces you'll probably see different norms or the lack of such norms in these spaces. So that's one aspect. So you also actually contextualize your experience in Shanghai. Shanghai is probably the most international city in China. It has a long colonial history. It is very pro-Western. So therefore, it's likely to see actually more hegemonic, if you like, Western norms or global norms of masculinity taking root in a kind of middle class, male, urban class, middle class. So I think that those contexts are important. It's important to recognize that there are actually cultural representations of the soft masculinity historically, and there are also actually the kind of more cosmopolitan and contemporary forms of masculinities. But there are also other forms of masculinities actually contextualized in its specific time and space. So that's probably my sort of an answer, but thanks for sharing those stories. It's great.
Okay, thank you. So I'll go on. Please start raising your hands if you feel like, there we go. There was, however, a question from Matthew to Spyros early on. Matthew, do you want to come in, or shall I just read it?
Yeah. So Spyros, you said a phrase that I've been thinking about quite a bit. I'm sure you saw the question, but for the others in the group who might not have seen it, I'm really wondering about the connection between sexual orientation and gender expression as it relates to homophobic experiences, because there's some cool research coming out showing that it's much more tied to gender expression than it is to sexual orientation. But I have to think that like the reason that people are worried about non-conforming gender expression is because of a sexual minority threat, right? Yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
So first of all, we have to remind ourselves that my narrators were speaking about their children years. So we focus on primary school kids that in that age don't really know what a homosexual or a gay is. So they have heard the word and they know they perceive this identity as not a man. So it would be difficult in that age to say that a little boy is calling a faggot to someone else because they have a problem with their sexuality, because they don't really have a sexuality then. Not in children are sexual, but they don't really get what they feel or what to express. So it was really interesting that in all of my interviews, primary school was like the major area of discussion about homophobia, and not like the later years of school. And it was usually like the homophobia that has remained to their memories is about the gender expression and the exclusion they faced because of that, because they weren't correct boys, let's just say. They couldn't play football correctly or successfully. they couldn't do the things boys do. Yes, and they were hanging out with girls, which is like the number one point of excluding others and calling them gay. So the homophobia based on sexuality was like later on generations, and it was in a smaller frequency than gender expression. It was like a jerk in high school, in Lyceum, in the last classes of school, who had a problem and was known to be really problematic, and no one really liked that person. But homophobia based on gender expression was what it was widely, accepted in the primary school. It was like the number one boundary between boys and the proto-gays, let's just say, kids. So yes, I mean, when I was analyzing the data, I didn't, I wasn't ready to go that way. But it came to me with the narration of the boys, like they focused on that, and it wasn't because they were, perverts or stuff like that. This was things that were coming from the parents and from the text that we said earlier. From their fellow students was they're not acting like boys, they don't do successfully what other boys do, and they fail at this. I don't know if I answered your question.
Any other questions? Do raise your hands if you want to write them on the chat. I may have as you're thinking, I may have something to. So your presentation, Spyros, kind of reminded me, because you were framing it a lot. I really like the idea that you brought, that the faggot child is kind of twice removed from the man. I think that's why I would be taking, because I find that really kind of interesting to think with. But a lot of the way in which you were framing your data and your research questions reminded me of some of the conversations that are happening in the UK at the moment with regards to trans teenagers and trans children. The so-called turf wars, and the various kind of legal disputes around how can a child know their gender identity, and how, as in, the kind of the people who are critical of gender services for teenagers, turning gender identity into this very special category of decision making, almost, or of consent, that doesn't apply to any other kind of medical practice, right? Because teenage, you can give teenagers a contraceptive pill, and they can consent to it without their parents, but they don't seem to consent to other kinds of hormonal treatment. And so this idea of it ultimately kind of boils down to a sense of or to this very old narrative of the child being lacking autonomy, not just the child, but also kind of the woman, for instance, lacking autonomy. Yeah, I mean, I just wonder if you have anything to say with regards to that, because from what I recall, you brought it up a bit at the beginning of the talk. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to that sense of not knowing or not being able to know, and then maybe potentially the parents not wanting to call them anything because that would just kind of actually inscribe it. So this sense of you don't know what you are doing, or you don't really know what you are.
Yes, children usually lack agency, or more precisely, they take agency away from children, as we saw in the quotes and as I saw in the interviews, because we have a really, we're not ready for this. We want children to represent the future and to be exactly what we want them to. We want a nice reproductional, innocent future and stuff like that. Kind of like Edelman approaches it, but as I saw from the interviews, children, they don't exactly know what is going on in their bodies or their heads or desires, but they don't get to try it. They don't get to experience it. I don't know if they, if they should have full agency. Like, I guess there are some choices that some children may not be ready to make because they don't know a lot of things. But we take this the child identity as a basis to intervene in their lives and agency, and to really make them the way we want them to be, not like listening to them or wanting to help them experience what they want to experience or feel like they want to experience. I had a reference to my presentation from a Greek academic, Dimitri Makriniotti, which says exactly this, that the child identity is the basis of that, and we use this immaturity and emptiness and the strangeness of the child in a way that we can intervene in the development of their identity and form it in a way that we want, the adults want, and to represent exactly the identities that we want in a way that we exactly, want, in a way that we want. I wasn't ready for this question actually, because I haven't really read that much because you mentioned trans wars, the turf wars in England and trans kids, but this is my first thoughts on this, based on the research that I conducted, that we don't really let children decide for themselves, because we really think that they are not to be trusted with this decision. As I said, they are treated as unreliable narrators of themselves, of their experiences and their emotions. And we decided we are the reliable narrators of their experiences for some reason that I don't really get.
But then there's also, I mean, no one's asking questions, so I might as well start. We might as well talk. I mean, I think there's also then that sense that we want to deny, for instance, like sexuality to children, while at the same time being so culturally paranoid that children may be engaging in sex or may be actually super sexual. So this kind of the demon of the sexual child, which, I mean, which creates a lot of sexual panics around children, right? I mean, of course, all the right ones in terms of child sexual abuse, but which easily then magnify into, porn being, the problem is, what about children, so it becomes this, it's quite almost like, it's quite Foucauldian, right? This sense of, no, children are pure and are always defined in the negative, in kind of the negative, like they're not adults, they're not capable of decision making, they're basically just negative, existent like beings, but then at the same time, they're also potentially really, really sexual.
Yes, and we like to behave like heterosexuality is such a strong naturalized norm. But this is the part that I skipped in my presentation because of time. But we see that parents are really concerned about even the slightest, wrong company they may have, the wrong friend. And you see that this nature, this undeniable nature that we all should respect, it's just like, one way away from really getting ruined because one wrong person, one gay person may affect their children and give them that contagious homosexuality and corrupt them, because we think that, you know, innocence must be protected, and so our kids from this illness.
Yeah.
Because one of the mothers was really saying to her son that he should be cautious of the restrooms in the school. He was like 14, 15 years old then, because boys do weird things there. And that was really fascinating, because at one hand you have like this contagious death, to reference Douglas, but at the same time you have this rationalizing of homosexuality and queerness, like it's just something boys do. It's not like homosexuality. This is the male sexual drive, and it is a really weird way to discuss about this, because it really contradicts itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's exactly the same. I'll pass to John now, but it's exactly the same that some gender critical feminists in the UK that write about, you know, the transgender issue, or like however they being actually contagious and a social kind of pandemic, because kids just get it in school. John.
So thanks to everybody for the presentations. I've really enjoyed all three of them. Yeah, again, I'm getting so much from this. I'm really thinking a lot. I've got a question. I think it's a question primarily for Matthew, but I think it's a question that Spyros could also speak to. In fact, Matthew, you draw on intersectionality as a framework for thinking about research design and your object of study. So you're already alive to the question I'm about to ask you, really, and it's about class and how important social class is in thinking about the way in which masculinity is figured, the way in which masculinity is enacted and performed in all manner of social and cultural settings. And one of the potential limitations of doing work where your object of study is university students is the dynamics of class in elite universities aren't necessarily the same dynamics that you find in broader culture and society. And it strikes me that in both of these papers, there's something to be said about the way in which class maps onto the way in which sexuality is understood and discussed, and the way in which masculinity is also understood and discussed. So this is like a really, really long-winded route into saying, have you thought about class in terms of your research design and your object of study, Matthew? And what have you got to say about it?
Yeah, thank you. And that's still only the second most long-winded question after Joe's.
I could have said it so much more succinctly. I should have said, tell me about why class matters, Matthew.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. And I think mostly it's a call to action for me, because I haven't dealt with that nearly as much as the topic deserves. And my first thought was like, obviously it matters in America. I wonder if it's definitely a bigger deal in England and in the UK, where class, and this isn't my area, so you guys can correct me here, but I got the sense that like class could supersede race in UK is like a bigger phenomenon that people are dealing with, whereas like in America, obviously it is still a very big factor. But when I read intersectionality papers and papers on identity stuff, we're rarely dealing with class to the extent that we should in America. So a call to action for me to do a better job acknowledging that. And then, I mean, the research that I'm familiar with, you're spot on. Like there's there's a rural masculinity work, which is talking, it's still very much like it seems like it's on the fly. People aren't very comfortable being very open about same-sex behavior compared to, what can even be a gay capital, like in a liberal urban university. It's a funny clash almost between like people who are finding more acceptance of like gay identities and non-conforming behaviors, like Eric Anderson's work, inclusive masculinity stuff, seems pretty descriptive to me of like a more liberal context. And even in conversation with him, I'm like, I grew up in conservative Christian Utah, and that as a gay man, that was not my experience, And he said, oh, that's because you grew up, in a very Christian small town place, and that's it. Yep. So that it did very much boil down to a working class background versus a professional background. And I didn't explore those ideas in this work, but I'd like to get into that more in the future. Any other thoughts on that?
And ultimately, really, I think many of us would agree that's the fault line that runs through Eric's work, Mark's work, Max Morris's work, making knowledge claims based on an extremely limited sample of middle-class white kids. They're always white, middle-class white kids in elite universities, and the way in which they choose to perform their gender and sexual identity at a very specific moment in time when you're on a campus university, away from home, in a completely different setting. And none of those things seem to, and to then turn that into the claim that homophobia is on the decline. We live in a much more liberal and tolerant society. Sure, we do if you're middle class, white, well educated. You were always living in a really tolerant liberal society when you were middle class, white and educated. You haven't got to go very far away from the universities that Eric and his coterie work at to find people who are really, really different and have very, very different attitudes, I think.
And I trimmed for space I did sexual orientation, then I did the ethnic racial background, and then the third was the intersection between the two. And I just didn't want to try and mash it all in there. But exactly to what you're speaking, especially the two Latino men in my sample who identified as gay, who were born in Mexico, actually had to leave Mexico and move. Both of them moved in with grandparents who were in California to find a more accepting environment, because it just wasn't working down there, in a rural, lower class environment. So
I think you're probably right, though. I think, as a white working class homosexual in Britain, class boils my piss is the expression we would use here. Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you for the
to answer as well. I will agree with Matthew, and I will have to acknowledge it better and be aware of it in the future, because I didn't have time. But at that time when I was researching and writing my thesis, although I will say that I didn't meet class, but in a weird way, I met class ambitions. I saw that many parents were really focused on their kids' grades. And this is where I mentioned first thing, that family is like a group socially represented by its members. So you can see that even though I didn't really have the class status, let's just say, that homosexuality was in a way an obstacle in these class ambitions. So I don't know whether, I mean, obviously class formed their reaction and the formation of their queer identities, like their parents' reaction and their queer identities. But I think that it comes back to it as, I don't know, not only the basis, but like the end point, something to, get better. And that's why homosexuality and queer identities, I think there is a weird connection with class. Like if you have this identity, you may spoil this image of the family and their ambitions. So these things may meet at that point. I don't know. I'm really, sharing my thoughts on this. It's not really coherent right now.
I think that's a really exciting thought, actually, that a queer identity somehow supersedes or gets over the problem of class. It's not something I've thought myself, but I think it's an exciting idea. It's an idea to think about for sure.
And I think it's not weird that sometimes, white, gay, successful men, in all these sense, they have all the privilege of the world, let's just say, they will hide their queer identity, like the homosexual identity. I won't say the queer identity in this case, because that would be the one point that separates them from the success that they were raised to achieve. I think James Baldwin had written something like that. I don't want to take credit for it, but yes, obviously class is like a part of this, a really important part of this.
Can I respond briefly? So I think that John's question and João's question are actually in a way related, because João's example is basically an example of different class stratification and how they have inflected the kind of expression masculinity in the kind of contemporary global city, Chinese city context. And I think that it is an important argument to see the relationship between gender and class, or at least in the context of contemporary China. For example, in the Mao era, presumably, there's no gender difference. Yeah. So women would be dressed as the same as men, and men would be dressed or behaved similarly like women. Men also did housework, and women also went farming and so on. Of course, there are a lot of actually debates about this kind of gender conformity, whether it's a good thing or not. But in the past 30 to 40 years, with China's neoliberal process, basically the kind of entering into the global capitalist economy, what happened was that, so on the one hand, there's a sharp stratification of this society, with different new forms of classes emerged, and the middle class really contingent of the society started to grow, and they started to follow actually more the kind of Western global cosmopolitan trend of masculinity and femininity. So remember, in the 1980s and 90s, there were huge debates in China saying that Chinese men are not men, actually, only do not have masculinity. I mean, look at Schwarzenegger or whatever. So these Western men are real men. So basically, that was a class aspiration of the middle class in Chinese cities at the time. So that also corresponds with João's experience of your experience in a Shanghai gay bar. So the kind of Western masculinity as a middle class masculinity. But on the other hand, so what people that you meet in kind of Shanghai tubes, etc. So whatever that old age is, we don't know that person's class background. But I would say that in that, for that people of that generation, probably the kind of gender distinction, as well as a kind of global hegemonic norms, as well as code of conduct, such as the social distancing and whether it's appropriate or not to touch another person's arm and so on. So that would actually be a kind of sign of a class. You can read it as a sign of class in a kind of urban, everyday Chinese context. So going back to your question of the slippages between the cultural representation that I'm talking about and your lived experiences in Shanghai, there is always, in a way, actually a slippage between representation and analysis. I guess that for Whiskey Chow, she was responding to the dominant discourse about Asian masculinity in the West, not necessarily rooted in the everyday life in Shanghai. And at the same time, so basically in the West, there was all the imagine discourses of Fu Manchu or whatever, so the kind of emasculated Asian stereotypes and representations. Of course, we can also say that her representation herself itself dealing with a kind of middle class discourse and with the ability of being a performing artist and performing in Victoria and Albert is itself a class distinction. So I think that it is important to bear in mind those different layers of, if you like, between representation and everyday practice, and the connection between class mobility as well as gender distinctions.
Yeah, I mean, the whole question of I'm chipping in now, but the whole question that John brought up with class, I mean, it reminded me, and I'm not that an historian of such an earlier period, but like Chris Chitty's book Sexual Hegemony, and also Michael Rock's book Forbidden Friendships, looking at the issue of sodomy laws in the Renaissance, right? And the issue was that people were not kind of night police or vice cops, as it were not so much policing sodomy because of any kind of identity, but because sodomy was actually or was actually troubling the very much kind of material relations of the social order, including potentially cross-class fucking, but also the threats that would bring to the kind of the family as beginning to have this like fundamental role in the production and kind of accumulation of capital, and increasingly I'm kind of drawn to that idea of actually how we're thinking these questions of gender and sexuality as actually fundamentally perhaps questions of material relations and of very much economic relations and the kind of the development of capital and global economies too, obviously.
You're a Marxist, João.
Of course.
As am I.
Very well brought up.
As am I.
Any final questions or points? Otherwise, just like keep on chatting all day about Marxism. Well, we will wrap up, I guess. It was a really great panel. I think that the three, as we saw from most of the last question, all three papers spoke in different ways to kind of very similar or sets of concerns, at least, even if coming from very different perspectives and very different kind of objects. Thank you very much, Spyros and Hongwei and Matthew. It was fantastic. I think the next panel is at 6 o'clock. Am I right? Yes, there is a panel on digital masculinities chaired by Jose and with Jaime, Marco, and Broderick Chow and Irolaine. So tune in for that. Looks really exciting. Have a coffee or a snack, and we will see you later.
Thank you so much for the moderation too.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.